Those 8, and the vote is corrected under Standing Order 149. I therefore call on Members' Order of the Day number 3.
Sustainable Biofuel Bill, second reading.
I call the Honourable Member Dr Kennedy Graham.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Sustainable Biofuels Bill be now read a second time. Mr Speaker, I took over the energy portfolio from Jeanette Fitzsimons from her departure, and thus her Sustainable Biofuels Bill. That bill is now in my name. The bill was referred to the LGE Committee following its first reading in July 2009, which referred to a subcommittee of 3 members, 1 National, 1 Labour and 1 Green. Officials from the Ministry of Economic Development produced a report for our small and happy band, and then, in a fit of contrition, hastened back to the subcommittee with a request that large parts of their work be deleted on grounds of confidentiality. Weird as that was, a majority in the committee assented. MED's verbal advice was threefold. First, the New Zealand proportion of biofuel consumption to total petrol diesel was tiny. At 0.6 billion litres, it was 0.5% of the total. Most was locally produced, only Gull imported. This compared with 5% in the European Union and about 8% in the United States. In the case of the EU, when its production was low, it had set mandatory targets for increasing renewable energy in the form of biofuels, 5.25% in 2010 and 10% in 2020. This resulted in the EU importing in haste from many sources, South America, North America, Southeast Asia. And that explained the EU's interest back in 2007 in developing importation standards. Secondly, according to officials, most New Zealand companies voluntarily provided information on their fuel imports to MED. Gull, for example, did so with respect to biofuels. And third, developing legislation to introduce standards specifically for biofuels would be complex and time-consuming, usually taking about a year. While Europe did it, that was because of the reasons I advanced earlier. In the New Zealand case, for those same reasons, it would not really be worth it. Mr Speaker, frankly, the Green Party did not find those reasons to be sufficient for not proceeding with the bill. In the subcommittee group, I explored with officials 2 things. First, whether the EU directive was initiated in the context of an anticipated increase in biofuel imports rather than as a reaction. Second, what degree of confidence the public might have in a continued New Zealand voluntary regime. The answers of officials appeared to please at least the subcommittee chair. On my request, the subcommittee explored the extent to which the New Zealand public might be assured that biofuel imports would be beyond reproach. I floated an additional possible requirement that the Minister be required to report to the House annually with a sign-off that no biofuel imports from an unsustainable source had been imported into New Zealand. This appeared to displease the subcommittee chair. Not surprisingly, the Green Party maintained a different view from that of the government on sustainable biofuels. The preference of the government and of the biofuel industry was for a system of voluntary reporting. There was also ECA's confidence that such a reporting system was meeting its purpose. In the Green view, these considerations do not in themselves constitute a sufficient reason for New Zealand to confine itself to such a modest framework for biofuels production and importation. While biofuel use in New Zealand remains low at 0.1%, it will, we think, be prudent to establish time-specified quantitative targets for increased imports and sustainability criteria under legislation. The EU standards had been introduced at a time when its imports were low. It would we thought, be prudent to establish time-specified targets, an anticipation of greater targeted levels. As part of its share in the global responsibility to combat climate change and preserve global food integrity, New Zealand should follow suit, rather than wait and see whether the market for imports here might first increase. Such a laissez-faire approach to global climate change and sustainability would prove to be inadequate to the challenge which the international community confronts. Finally, New Zealand's international obligations under its free trade agreements did not in themselves preclude the merit or the feasibility of introducing sustainable criteria for biofuel imports. This bill, I suspect, will be voted down. But let the last word go to Jeanette Fitzsimons, and I quote, "The idea that it is okay to feed good human food, like grains, to motor cars, while people are starving, shows what happens when someone pursues a single-minded goal, excludes all other considerations, and totally loses sight of the big picture. It also shows the abject failure of the market to allocate scarce goods when there are very big differences in ability to pay. There is only so much agricultural land available, so there is an absolute limit on how much grain can be produced in the world. We can increase yields with clever management, but we can never overcome the fact that there are limits. There will never be enough to feed all human mouths and all the world's vehicles. When it comes to market competition between the fuel tanks of the wealthy nations and the mouths of the hungry who cannot afford to pay much for food, it is obvious who will win. In this context, unrestricted biofuels can mean genocide." End quote. The Green Party will, of course, be voting for this bill.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Minister, Nikki Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very interesting.